Welcome to another episode of Real Life Renos, the podcast. Today we're joined by frequent guest Ron Wickman, who is an architect specializing in barrier-free design. Ron joins us from Edmonton, Alberta. We are also joined by Robert Lipka. Robert has a master's degree in urban and rural planning from Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada, and is a member of the Alberta Professional Planners Institute. He's currently a principal urban designer with the City of Edmonton's urban design team and has 20-plus years working in Edmonton, Toronto, and Auckland, New Zealand, providing designs and reviews that focus on urban design, universal design, and crime prevention through environmental design. I'm sure we could do a whole podcast just on Robert's experiences in New Zealand, but today we'll be talking about creating accessible outdoor spaces, and the conversation veered off into the increasing prevalence of infill housing, some of them fronting on back alleys. Can accessibility and appropriate outdoor living be created in these spaces? We'll find out. Welcome to Robert and Ron. I'm so happy to have our three-person podcast going today because we're going to learn a great deal.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. It's nice to meet you, and I'm looking forward to this chat.
Perfect.
Definitely.
And
Yeah,
Ron,
and
good to see you again.
yeah, thanks. And as always, I do enjoy this. I like the idea of adding some more expertise into our conversations for sure.
Absolutely. We want to talk a bit, at least in the beginning, about residential outdoor spaces. There are so many people who live in homes that are 50, 100 years old, and they want to stay there for as long as they possibly can. Perhaps they've been turned over in the family, but other people are making their own kind of home out of it. The point is the homes aren't being changed very much, and at the same time, we have newer subdivisions being built that look very different from the subdivisions that we all probably grew up in. Robert, what can you tell us about creating beautiful outdoor spaces in this type of an environment?
Oh, that could be a really long answer to that one. But first of all, I grew up in downtown Toronto, so I can't really relate to growing up in a suburb, thankfully. But our suburbs here in Edmonton over time have changed. And yes, when subdivisions were first happening in the 50s and 60s, there was a lot of space around homes. Sometimes the homes were developed with rear alleys, rear lanes where garage access was, and you had a big backyard. And now, over time, as things are changing and progressing in a lot of these subdivisions, and because obviously developers are trying to, eke out every dollar they can, the size of lots is a heck of a lot smaller than it used to be, and so um, you're getting homes that are not very wide, or sorry, yeah, well, the site is not very wide, and then the home basically takes up almost the entire width of the site. And you get a little tiny backyard if you're lucky. If it's a front-loaded garage, which a lot of them are, the cars will access from the street, and you have a garage at the front, and your house is in behind, which from an urban design perspective is obviously not ideal as well. And then some of the variations are provided in some of these subdivisions where you do have rear alleys. So they're trying to go back in time and provide rear alleys on some of these newer subdivisions, and which is makes it a little bit more efficient. But the problem is then you have a difficulty in accessing portions of your property. I'll give you an example. If you have you're storing your gardening implements, your lawnmower, etc., in your garage, some of these houses are so tight on the lot that there's not much space in between a fence and the house itself. So it's difficult to move a lawnmower or even some garden implements from the garage to get to the front yard. So that makes it really difficult. And you can imagine with somebody who has accessibility issues, somebody in a wheelchair, mobility scooter, has some mobility challenges, difficulty walking, has to use crutches or canes, that would be very difficult. So yeah, it's looking at people having to bring their equipment down the alley, down the side street, up the front street and then get to the front of their house. Also, garbage collection is difficult as well too, where a lot of these newer subdivisions, even though they have rear alley access, most of the garbage collection is taken on the front of the house. So you can imagine somebody probably has their recycling bins and garbage cans in their garage, but the city's not collecting the garbage from the rear alley, like the neighborhood where I live in Westmount, that happens. But some of these newer subdivisions, that's not happening. You have to bring all your garbage to the front of the house, and so that's really difficult because then you'd either have to bring it around the corner, as I described, or bring it right through your house to get up to the front, to put your garbage at the front of the house. So for collection, and again, somebody who's who doesn't have any mobility challenges, that's hard enough. And imagine if you had a mobility challenge, that would be extremely difficult to do. So there's a lot of things that are happening now, in subdivision design, that are making it really difficult to age in place, for people to live in these houses, for their entire life. And so that's a really important thing in planning that we need to consider.
There are safety concerns as well for everybody. I mean, those narrow spaces between houses, they're not usually lit. Whatever kind of a pathway they put down may not be suitable for somebody who needs a mobility device.
Mhm. Oh, correct. Like I have CPTED training, so crime prevention through environmental design. And you look at some of these units where, like you said, there might be a little walkway in between, but because the houses are generally 2 or even 3 stories tall, you can imagine how dark it would be in that little walkway in between the house if you have one. And so, people could be, walking up and down the alleys or on the front of the street, and sneak down these alleys and get into backyards and things. So there's definitely septed issues, for people, living in those homes, and then obviously, like I said, accessing their properties makes it difficult, especially if they have a mobility challenge, because of the tight nature of it. So, yeah, lighting would be important, putting appropriate fencing in locations, so it just makes it a bit more difficult for people to access, if they're worried from a crime prevention perspective. So there's a lot of things that this new type of development that's happening. The term used to be new urbanism. Now they're calling it just, basically building lots that are just, more dense, right? So that's the city's pushing for greater density, which is great. But unfortunately, it doesn't work for some people, right? It's like I had mentioned, somebody with mobility challenges, these types of houses would be very difficult to live in, even visit. When I review applications at the city, I try to push for, if you cannot build a fully accessible home, at least seek to construct one that's visitable, right? Meaning that somebody could visit a friend. There would be a washroom on the ground floor of the unit, making sure that the doors are obviously wide enough, et cetera, to access the house. So it's not fully accessible, but at least it's visitable. And even when I'm working with developers, to push for that is sometimes a challenge. So yeah, we're things are getting a little bit better in that respect, especially some of the newer buildings that are happening downtown. That's been a bit easier to push for, but in suburbia, I'm still having difficulty pushing for those kind of elements in homes.
Right. And visitable homes are something that Ron and I have spent quite a bit
Yeah.
of time talking about. So let's bring you in on this, Ron, because with the push to density, which Robert has mentioned, granny suites, secondary units, now we've got shared yards and the need for shared access. So one person might need an accessible yard, somebody else, maybe the primary landowner doesn't. How do we maneuver around all of that?
Yeah, so I just want to pick up on some of the things that Robert said as well, uh, and starting with this concept of the visitability. Uh, we have talked in the past, Karen, you and I, about this issue of visitability, and we did look at it from the point of view of planning new subdivisions and rules around creating housing, or creating a landscape that allows for easier, uh, uh, making it easier to have the no step entrance at the front door. And something that I've never really been able to get a handle on, and Robert and I talk frequently, but I never really talked about this particular issue. But when it comes to the city being involved in the development of new neighborhoods, suburban neighborhoods, um, does the city have any enforcement rules in terms of a certain percentage have to be, or there's a certain density that's only allowed in a subdivision, so you have to have a certain proportion of like single family compared to multifamily. You have to have a certain proportion of laned type development as opposed to front car garages. Or does the developer kind of have free reign, which I've always thought was the case, that the developer has to meet a certain criteria when it comes to water management and the landscape. But once that's met, they can have as many single family lots as they want on the land and so on. So before I kind of get into the weeds any more than that, I wonder, Robert, if you have any comments about that, because certainly when you get into areas like that have architectural controls, often I'm faced with the fact that an architectural control is that you have to have at least three steps at the front door, which completely goes against visitability, and then we have to ask for special permission from the developer. And so it seems to me that the city kind of stays out of really getting into looking at subdivision development with this kind of accessibility lens. Like they might promote it maybe, but they tend to stay away from any kind of enforcement or, strong um, regulations.
Yeah, no, all great questions, Ron. As I was indicated earlier, we are getting improved development of apartment buildings and such downtown and in other, more highly dense areas where you're getting apartments and condominiums where they are more accessible than they used to be. But unfortunately, single family housing, you're right, you're bang on. Like there aren't, as far as I'm aware, I'm an urban designer. I'm not a planner at the city, so I'm not, intimately familiar with the zoning bylaw, especially the new one. I have had some input into it, so I'm generally aware of it. And I'm pretty confident that there's not a lot of requirements for developers in those types of single family homes. So hence you're getting that problem where you mentioned about having, three steps up to get to the front of the house. And of course there's reasons for that. We live in a winter city, and for building basements and making sure they stay dry and all those things. But there are ways around it. Yes, it may cost more money in the beginning, but it's definitely worth it to look at developing homes that, I know you are always pushing for. You have no step access into the front entry. But even if, like, I've seen some designs where maybe a side or even a rear entry can be designed so that it can provide a ramp, right? So there are ways to do it. I've shown examples to developers of other cities, other winter cities that have similar issues that we have in Edmonton. But unfortunately, as you know, we don't have a lot of influence on that. And our access design guide, the document that focuses on accessibility, is unfortunately only solely focused on city projects. So any project that the city is working on, rec centers, swimming pools, libraries, everything that we build and everything that we maintain, technically is supposed to be fully accessible. That's going to take time because our document's about 4 or 5 years old. So, but yeah, it doesn't apply to private development, which is unfortunate. So as I said, we're getting it in some of the more dense developments. We're getting more accessibility considerations, but in single family housing, nothing, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And we really live in a world where the it's always considered the market will dictate, right? So um, developers will always say, "Don't make us do things. We'll do it when the market asks for it." And we both sit on the Barrier Free Design Council here in Alberta. And I remember when I first started almost 30 years ago with the committee. Um, I was surprised to learn that the hotel industry in Alberta had lobbied to not have any real strong accessibility rules around the hotel suites themselves. So if any public washrooms have to meet code, the entrance has to meet code, but there was no demand or requirement to have any of the suites, hotel rooms accessible. And to this day, that is still true here in Alberta. We don't have
Yeah.
any rules around that. So when the industry says we'll do it when the demand is there,
Yeah. Oh,
are
I
they
yeah.
saying the demand's not there?
Oh,
Is that
oh,
what's happening?
hey, as you know, I'm not from here originally. When we moved back to Canada from New Zealand, because I lived there for 10 years, and we moved back here in Canada in 2015. One of the first hotels we stayed in before we got this house was just north from us here, near the old airport, and they only had one room available because it was late in the evening, and it happened to be the accessible suite. And that was the only choice we had. And I said, okay, fine. I felt guilty taking it, but there was nobody else needed it, so we took it, and it wasn't accessible at all. Like it was awful. It was poorly designed. So yeah, it's lovely to say they have accessible units, but I was really shocked. I've stayed in a few hotels now and throughout Alberta, having come from New Zealand where they have a lot more stringent rules, especially for hotels. Like you think tourism is one of their bread and butters, right? Like that's the key thing, where New Zealand makes a heck of a lot of money is tourism. So they have a really strong process where uh, new hotels have to go through an accessible, they call it Be Accessible program, and they get different levels, right? So you get like a gold, silver, bronze. And so you see the hotels that have gold are stunning. Like you go to them and they're so accessible. They're so well designed. Most of the rooms are fully accessible, not just a few. Um, yeah, we have a long way to go, unfortunately, in Canada.
I'm going to speak
And
on
that,
behalf of the homeowners, and Ron and I have talked about that before. The homeowners and the homeowner wannabes, who are the people that they are waiting to hear from. They don't know what they want. They don't know what the options even are. They're not thinking 10, 20, 30, 50 years down the road. So I feel that it's up to the developers to be leading the charge and seeing what the demographics are saying and building to suit that demographic. But can we pull it back a bit to the design of these newfangled houses with the skinny lots and the infill housing and the granny suites in back? How do they create an accessible outdoor space for themselves in that sort of a physical environment that they don't have any control over?
Right. Great question, Karen. Yeah, it's obviously, having, like I mentioned, some of the homes that I have reviewed do actually have accessible rear entries, which is great. So if you have, or even a granny flat, where they have an accessible entry, and so yeah, it'd be nice that somebody who's living in that unit could actually garden. And so looking at putting in the backyard, having some raised beds, making sure obviously they're a good height, space around them so people can in a wheelchair mobility scooter could maneuver around them. Looking at making sure that you have, a water spout nearby. There's all these little things. Obviously, garden. I'm not an avid gardener. Usually things die in my hands. But anyway, I try to do my best. But yeah, my mom wasn't a very good gardener either, and she always told me. She said, if things don't last, that means it wasn't tough enough, and I don't want that in my garden. So just rip it out and start something different. And so yeah, that's my philosophy. Is so I'm not the best gardener, but yeah, there's little obviously elements you'd like when you're gardening. If you're in a mobility a scooter or wheelchair, that you would really appreciate having, and making sure you have that a little bit extra space right around those areas, having a hard surface. It doesn't have to be concrete. Obviously, from a climate resilience perspective, we don't want to see too many backyards filled with just concrete. We could make sure we have a lot of grass and or at least some soil. and so just putting a different type of material down, right? So you can move from the rear entry door from your house and get to the garden. Perhaps it's like a hog-in or any type of ground, more not really gravel, but something a little bit finer that actually gives you a decent enough base that you can run a wheelchair mobility scooter over them. Things like that are just some of the aspects to consider, lighting and other things that would be helpful for a garden like that.
Ron,
I'm
let's
sure
bring you
Ron
in
has
on
some.
this because you're the architect who would be involved in perhaps creating some of these homes, and you would be working with designers and urban designers, people like Robert, as well as the city and the planners and so forth. What would you do if you were creating this sort of an environment? Would you do anything different? Would you orient the houses differently? What would you do?
Wow. there, there were a lot of questions there. Um, I, I guess a couple things just based on what we've been talking about. First, I think for the homeowner, uh, usually when they're planning their house to build their new house with a new home builder, uh, the the work of the landscaping for the most part is left up to the homeowner. So the builder will likely give you some concrete to get to the front door. They usually leave the backyard alone unless there is a garage in the back, like there's a lane. So a front car garage, you might get the driveway and the sidewalk to the front door, and then maybe a tree or something like that. And then you usually afterwards you do your own planning to landscape. And again, it gets back to something you mentioned, Karen, is uh, people generally don't know a lot about accessibility. Certainly, if they don't have the need to learn about accessibility. So if they're your average homeowner, they don't have family members with disabilities or friends, then it just doesn't dawn on them to even want to learn about it. So it is a big challenge, and I do think it's up to the design industry, architects, urban planners, landscape architects, and then the developers and builders to also educate themselves and provide the base for people to work with. So there are things that I think we can do in the planning stages that can really assist the homeowners. So one of the things I was thinking about as Robert was talking was some of the work that I've gotten involved with, and I remember working on an infill, a duplex, where we couldn't achieve a no step entrance at the front. The lot was skinny. There wasn't much distance from the front sidewalk to the front door, and the existing infrastructure, sewer lines, and so on, were fairly high up in fairly high up in the land. So we couldn't dig down far enough unless we lowered the sewer lines and so on, which is very, very expensive. In this case, what we did was we had to build new garages from the lane. So we actually built the garages higher, almost to the level of the main floor. And so the driveway to the garage door was relatively steep. So we kind of make the car do the work and get you up to that level, and then that would provide easier access. Uh, that's great for the homeowner, but it doesn't make it so great for anybody visiting, right? Because they'd still have to find a way to. If you were in a wheelchair visiting, you'd have to find a way to get up into the garage and then into the backyard. Um, Another example of a house, I just finished a backyard for an existing home that had been designed for somebody in a wheelchair. It's an infill inner city lot. The house was relatively accessible, but the whole backyard wasn't. So we ended up doing, because of the big backyard, we did a tiered, sort of like lily pads, a tiered decking situation. So you'd come out onto a deck from the back door, and that would be a bit of a deck, and then a ramp down to another level, and then a ramp down to the ground level. and then we built the garage to connect all of that. And so, with the use of planters and so on, we kind of shielded the ramps and we did them with a very gentle slope, with a 1 in 20 slope, so they weren't really considered ramps so much as they were just gently sloping pathways. So it created a quite a nice backyard. Everybody uses it in the same way, and anybody can use it. This particular gentleman actually uses a power wheelchair and uses a remote control on the wheelchair, and can maneuver around. So it worked out really well. But it just gets back to always having to kind of adapt to the situation, right? So we've just never been in a situation where we built houses to be more adaptable in the first place. And I constantly find myself in a place where I'm trying to provide a solution to create accessibility in an existing home, whether it be the home itself or the outdoor landscaping that is both functional, beautiful, and the hard one is economical, right? So
Mhm.
if you're starting from a really bad place, it's hard to make it inexpensive, right? So I always try to say that's not my fault. The expense of the thing is not it's not something I created, right? Um,
Well, and touching on that, Ron's point, like from a city's perspective, the thing that I get really frustrated with is that great architects like Ron come and build these great houses and accessory dwelling units in the back and all that stuff. But a lot of our rear alleys, as you know, Ron, especially in the older parts of Edmonton, aren't paved or are
yeah.
partially paved or are gravel, right? So it's all fine and dandy to have this beautiful accessory dwelling attached to a house, and it's you designers like yourself make it beautiful and accessible, but the person can't even get to their unit from the rear lane.
Hmm.
I don't know how they would access some of these if there's not enough space, to access it from the front, where the sidewalk is. So yeah, the city, I've been really pushing hard to make sure that we look at if we're going to permit these accessory dwelling units, which we're starting to do more of, which is great, to increase densities in these older, more established, stable residential neighborhoods. We got to redo our alleys and make them more accessible. Yeah.
And just to get into the the secondary suites, Robert, you can speak to this as well, because I'm not sure if this is unique to Edmonton or not, but we do have a particular city bylaw that allows you to do a secondary suite over a garage, for example, a detached garage in the back, that allows you to build something slightly larger than what is normally allowed, if you provide the accessibility features. So it's a bit of a carrot, I guess. You say you can build it bigger, but you have to, let's say, provide a residential elevator and make sure you have space to accommodate a, a wheel-in shower and maybe a little bit of a larger kitchen, that kind of thing. And so I know I got involved in that when the city was at the planning stages. Um, my the feedback I've gotten so far is that not very many builders or developers have really taken advantage of that regulation. But I'm not sure if that is unique to Edmonton or whether other cities have adopted
Uh,
a similar
Edmund,
concept.
Yeah, well, like we've been doing it for a while now. I know in Toronto, because I used to work for the city of Toronto many, many years ago. They've been doing that for a long while. Vancouver also has been doing that, getting more rear, houses basically fronting onto alleys and lanes, right? And some of them, you could knock down the garage and just build another house there in some of those situations. But yeah, you're right. We do. There's several of them in my neighborhood in Westmount here, which exactly what you described, having a unit up above a garage. I think there is one or two that I'm aware of that do have the lifts that they put in. But again, like I said, they're lucky in that the alley that they live upon recently redone a few years ago, so it's pretty smooth and easy to access. But there's a number of others, and including the alley behind my garage. It's got a lot of potholes. It's
Mhm.
really desperately in need of a redo. And if you had a mobility scooter wheelchair, good luck trying to get to your unit
Yeah.
using the alley. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I don't think we should just leave the. You mentioned something about the literally a new house that's fronting the lanes. Uh, that's certainly, I think, something here in Edmonton people would not be very familiar with. But I do know in Vancouver and Toronto that they're actually allowing, I don't know if everywhere in the city or just in certain parts of the city, where yeah, literally you can build another house on your lot, which has its own address and everything um, right from the lane. And I think it's a great idea myself. I know I live in a mature neighborhood myself, so not unlike you. I'm in Greenfield. Westmount is a sort of similar vintage. Um, I think that would certainly initially have some negative feedback from people in the neighborhood. I think they'd be worried about the lanes getting filled with cars parking and people visiting that other house and all that kind of stuff. So we're we're not there. Edmonton, Calgary, we're not um, the place that Toronto, Vancouver, Montreal are in, where density has just become a really, even a bigger issue than it is here. But it's interesting because I think we'll be faced with those challenges, in the next 10 years or so.
Oh yeah, and that's why I keep highlighting it to our, internal team in that because I've seen what happened, in Toronto and Vancouver, and how there's that pressure. So now imagine if you have a house fronting onto the rear alley. Now you got to provide, a decent alley so it's smooth and easy to access. You got to provide lighting, which a lot of our alleys don't have lighting, as you know. Even some, perhaps even some landscaping, etc. So yeah, it's going to make a huge change to the way the city functions, and how we're going to make sure we have the budget, to
Hmm.
pay for these things if we're going to go to that level. We're not there yet. You're right. In Edmonton, most of them are just accessory dwelling units, right? But in the future, yeah, you could see that pressure will come.
Hmm.
This is going in a whole different direction that I even imagined, talking about houses fronting on alleys. And when you were talking, I was thinking snow removal and garbage pickup and this whole business of dual addresses. And now you've got to name the lane. It's not just a back lane anymore. It's actually got to have a proper name because it's somebody's address. That just brings up a whole other world. You really actually see cities going in that direction.
Oh, they
Yeah.
have been. Yeah, there are
Yeah.
cities doing that now. So yeah,
Wow.
we have a long way to go, but yeah, it's something, especially in the older neighborhoods here in Edmonton. Like it makes total sense um, because especially the house that I own, like the lot is very wide and it's very deep, compared to like a house I grew up in Toronto. So there is a lot of space that's not really utilized, right?
Right.
And so, from a density perspective, it makes so much more sense to build, get more people living in communities like where I live, because they have great access to public transport, they have great access to shopping and etc. They can walk. It's the true nowadays, in urban design terms, it's the 15-minute city. That's the big spiel. But I always say I grew up in a 5-minute city, so
Hmm.
15 minutes is nothing new to me. Uh, that's been that way, in Toronto for a very long time. Um, so yeah, Edmonton's obviously at another level. And it's going to take much longer to get to that point, but it will happen eventually.
Hmm.
We can't keep building out. Right?
Right. I saw a real estate advertisement the other day. For some reason, it made it into my news feed because real estate ads normally don't. But this was a realtor who had used artificial intelligence to show what I imagine was a garage of some kind accessed by a back alley. And it was just a very large, concrete, low ceilinged building. But he had used AI to show you the possibilities, and it was just gorgeous. But then, of course, you get to the end of the pictures and you see the reality of it, and it was very dank and dreary.
I can imagine.
Yeah, but AI, there you go. You got to watch it. Any final comments about the use of any kind of special tools or artistry to create beautiful, accessible yards and outdoor spaces for people in the new housing environment? Anybody have a comment on that before we close
Uh,
out?
I just wanted to mention one thing, and I'd like to get into it in more detail probably later in the year, Karen. But we're just kind of waiting for the weather to get a little bit better. But uh, I happen to be in a situation right now that I think could provide a bit of an example of what all of this could potentially look like. And I live in the well, not deep south, the deep south of the mature neighborhood of Edmonton. So we're kind of bordering between sort of new suburbia and mature neighborhoods. And my mother lives in the house that I grew up in. They built in 1967 for my father, who used a wheelchair. So the house itself is a small bungalow, but it's quite accessible. And she's 81 now, and I really want her to be able to age in place. And we're at a better starting point than a lot of houses because um, we have the accessible house already. She had some issues with waterproofing. The foundation failed, and the basement got flooded, and all the rest. So we have this opportunity this spring and summer, to do a whole new landscaping. And I'm really thinking she's in a position where she can age in place and she can stay at home, and we can do the landscaping so that it's really positive for her. And then just to the south of her is a large green belt that the city over time has developed to have a nice hard surface pathway. People walk their dogs. It is a green belt, but there's the probably a 6 foot wide sidewalk that runs all along there. A lot of people use it, with baby carriages and bikes and strollers and wheelchairs and so on. And right beside my mom's house, we just finished a house that has been designed for a couple that wants to age in place. So was a tear down, brand new house. Right beside, there's a house across the street that was modified for somebody who uses a wheelchair, and then just up the street is a new, basically a house being built. It's a corner lot, but the garage suite, if you want to call it looks like a house, basically. So it's like two houses on the lot. And so all of a sudden, I find myself in this little corner of Edmonton, this small little dot in Edmonton that has all this great opportunity to demonstrate what a great little city environment could be for everybody, and including people with disabilities, including people who are aging. And so I'm excited about the prospect of being able to work on that. And I just, part of that is just to reinforce something that we said earlier, is when the city's planning all this stuff, and just such a great thing that we have Robert working with the city. Somebody's got to be asking those questions, like, what are we doing about our aging population? What are we doing about people with disabilities? That can never get lost, and it seems to, when there isn't somebody at the table that's asking those really very basic questions, right? But they're so important.
Yeah, no, no, you're right, Ron. It's like there's only a few people in our organization that really get involved in these kinds of things, and thankfully there are a number of us in the organization that are keep pushing for these kinds of things. And um, so it's going to take time, but at least we have some of the background documentation and policies now. Now it's about delivering it on the ground. But speaking
Hmm.
of on the ground, to answer Karen's question, well, just to add another thing, I grew up, like I said, I grew up in downtown Toronto. My backyard was basically 5 meters by 5 meters, so that was it. So a tiny little backyard compared to most suburban backyards. And so my mom was able to she did a lot of horizontal growing, right, or vertical growing, right. So yeah, obviously growing things that climb, right? Vegetables and etc. So I think there's people who are, in a mobility scooter, wheelchair, that have some mobility issues can still, you know. Safely and easily use a raised planter bed, and even do some vertical growing cucumbers, etc. So there's a lot of things you could do in a small space. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Mm.
So I think that it just takes a bit more thought. And there's a gentleman next to me. He used to grow oranges. He had orange tree in his garage. So it was incredible. So he had this beautiful garden, all the vegetables. And then he would say, "Oh, hey Rob, do you want an orange?" And he'd go into his garage because he had like it all heated and everything. And he was growing oranges. He was from Italy. He was a great guy. And so yeah, he would share his oranges with the neighbors. So you can grow things in a lot of interesting places. So
Take heart, there are solutions. Well, that's what we're
yeah.
all about, is providing people solutions. So, and that's a great way to bring this particular podcast to a close. Ron, thank you as always for joining me. And Robert, what a treat to have you here. We're going to keep you around and do another podcast with you. So for those who have enjoyed Robert's take on things, just wait for the next one, because we're going to delve increasingly into his area of expertise. So thank you all for joining us, and I look forward to seeing all of you again on the next episode of Real Life Renos, the podcast.